Okay, y'all, we are in Landmark History of American People, chapter 23, which is on pages 144, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. So we're going to read this together. Please follow along while we're reading. You got a picture there of James Bogardus. Bogardus constructed the first cast iron building in New York City in 1848, and that's a wood engraving. Oddly enough, although the growing United States had lots of land to spare, the most distinctive American way for a city to grow was not to stretch out. After the Civil War, Americans began using their own know-how, together with materials and know-how from all over the world, to stretch their cities up. Although some Americans were moving to the suburbs, more people than ever before wanted to live and work right in the center. Businessmen wanted to be where the action was, and many people who could afford to live in the suburbs still preferred to live downtown. With old kinds of construction, the tallest buildings had seldom been over 5 or 6 stories high. 2 problems had to be solved before buildings could go higher. The first problem, how to get people up and down, was beginning to be solved even before the Civil War. In a few luxury hotels, elevators carried guests up to the 5th and 6th floors. And in some early department stores, the elevator was an attractive curiosity. But people thought elevators were dangerous. They feared that if the rope holding the elevator cage should break, the passengers would drop to their deaths. Elisha Graves Otis found a way to dispel the fears. He invented a simple automatic safety brake. If the rope broke, instead of the cage plummeting to the bottom, the brake would automatically clamp the cage safely to the sides. Otis staged a demonstration in New York in 1854. He rode the elevator to the top. Then an attendant cut the rope while breathless spectators watched. As designed, Otis's safety brake swiftly clamped the cage in place, and Otis bowed nonchalantly to the crowd. On 146, Otis's early steam-driven elevators moved only 50 feet a minute, about half a mile an hour. To Americans who now could speed along on railroads at 40 miles an hour, the steam-driven vertical railway seemed to climb like a snail. But by 1880, the improved hydraulic elevators, pushed by water pressure in a long vertical cylinder, were climbing at 600 feet a minute. And by 1892, electric motors were carrying passengers up so fast that they felt their ears were being stopped up. The second problem, how to hold up the building, began to be solved when James Bogardus and others used cast iron for their buyers' palaces. It was no longer necessary to build a tall building like a pyramid with thick supporting walls on the lower floors. Cast iron construction helped the department stores keep the lower floors wide open. They enjoyed broad vistas and narrow pillars. They also permitted attractive show windows to the outside. But iron construction also made it possible to build higher and higher. Soon, at an 8-story building like Stuart's cast iron palace seemed small. The time was ripe for the skyscraper. Of course, Bogardus was only dreaming when he forecast buildings 10 miles high, but he was not far wrong when he told American builders that only the sky would be the limit. So we've got 2 pictures there. In 1851, James Bogardus built a 6-story open-framed cast iron fire watchtower on 9th Avenue and West 33rd Street in New York City. This was 5 years before he built his famous 8-story tall shot tower for the McCullough Shot and Lead Company. In 1853, Bogardus built a second open-frame cast iron fire watchtower at the corner of Spring and Varick Streets. And there's a close picture of the bell in Bogardus's Spring Street tower. If you look closely at the picture to the left, you will see that the bell hung in the mid-section of the tower. It was rung by a man who pulled a lever on the deck above the bell. Eventually, the city built 11 fire watchtowers, but they fell into disuse when the city's buildings became too tall for fire watchmen to see what was happening, and the fire department began to use a telegraph communication system. You can still see one of the original towers, however. It is only 3 stories tall, but you can find it the Mount Morris Fire Watchtower at Marcus Garvey Park in New York City. Bogardus himself constructed one of the first buildings of true skyscraper design. Its frame was a tall iron cage. If the cage was strong and rigid and solidly anchored at the bottom, then the building could go up high without needing thick walls at the bottom. They called it skeleton construction because its own rigid skeleton held the building up. The first time Bogardus actually tried this, his structure did not have any rooms at all. It was a skeleton-framed tower for an ammunition factory. In those days, manufacturers made lead shot by pouring molten lead through a sieve inside a high tower. The little liquid balls of lead dripped through a few at a time. As these plummeted down through the air, they became naturally rounded. And as they fell into the tank of water at the bottom, they hardened into their rounded shape, ready for use in a rifle or cannon. In 1855, when the McCullough Shot and Lead Company needed a new shot tower in New York City, Bogardus gave them his radical new design. He built them an octagonal iron tower 8 stories high. A tall iron cage, it needed no filled-in weight-bearing walls to hold it up. Yet it was strong. When the builders covered the openings in the iron frame with brick, the structure was just as strong as if they had built it of a heavy column of stone. But it was one thing to build a shot tower. It was quite another to trust the lives of hundreds to such a newfangled way of building. One of the first attempts occurred in Chicago, where William LeBaron Jenney served as the pioneer. An adventurous man of wild experience, he had helped build a railroad across Panama before there was any canal. In the Civil War, he served on General Sherman's staff as an engineer. In 1884, when the Home Insurance Company decided to construct a new office building in Chicago, they gave him the job. Okay, and so then we've got a picture here. Wrought iron had begun to revolutionize building construction, but builders were cautious. By 1884, William LeBaron Jenney's Home Insurance Building in Chicago was still one of the very first buildings in the world to use iron for a building that would hold hundreds of people at a time. Yet even as Jenney was erecting the building, steel became inexpensive enough that it could replace iron. And so, while the bottom floors were held up by iron, the skeleton for the top 3 floors of the building was made of steel. And that's a photo of the building there. Okay, so Jenney, who had probably, we're on page 148 now, heard of Bogardus's shot towers built 20 years before, decided to use an iron skeleton himself, and he completed his building in the next year. Even before Jenney finished building the first skyscraper, a new and better material, steel, came along. Jenney framed the first 6 floors of the Home Insurance Building with wrought iron. The top 3 stories he framed in steel. Steel, like wrought iron, was made almost entirely from iron ore, but steel was far superior. It was easy to shape wrought iron into beams and constructing and connecting plates because it bent easily. But wrought iron was not ideal for a skyscraper frame because it bent too easily. Steel was the answer, and it was steel that made higher and higher American skyscrapers possible. Though men had known how to make steel for centuries, the process had been difficult and time-consuming. As a result, steel was so expensive that people used it only for small objects. Blacksmiths made the swords by night in the Middle Ages by endlessly hammering, reheating, and then again hammering the blades. Until the mid-1800s, this was the usual way to iron iron to make it into steel. Then an Englishman, Henry Bessemer, invented a new mass production steel furnace. By blowing air through the molten iron mass, he was able to burn carbon out of it much more quickly. And now it was possible to produce 100 tons of steel from a single furnace in 12 hours. Though the English invented the process before the end of the 1800s, the United States led the world in steel production. It was producing almost twice as much steel as Great Britain was. Better, cheaper steel meant more tall buildings. New York soon followed Jenney's example. The skeleton system was especially useful for building sorry about my yawning, structures on the tiny lots of crowded Manhattan Island. In 1888, an architect named Bradford Gilbert was asked to design an 11-story building on Broadway. The lot was only 25 feet wide and 103 feet deep. Gilbert could not use old-fashioned heavy masonry for the building because the ground floor walls would have been too thick to create enough space even for a small room. And so he adopted steel and designed the most true iron skeleton building in New York City. And there's a picture there. They were reluctant to give Bradford Gilbert permission to build his 25-foot wide, 11-story tall building. They were convinced no iron skeleton building that tall could possibly stay up. But up it stood for 25 years. The Tower Building, as it was called, opened in 1889. It was demolished in 1914. And this photograph here is from about 1900. At first, the building inspectors refused a building permit for Gilbert's Tower Building because they believed that a building could not possibly stay up. I just said that. Even after he finished building it, Gilbert had to demonstrate his confidence in the structure by taking the offices at the very top for himself. Once he did, however, the age of the skyscraper had arrived. 25 years later, on the night of April 24, 1913, Woodrow Wilson pressed a button in Washington that lit the tallest habitable building in the world, the Woolworth Building in downtown Manhattan. The Woolworth Building was 55 stories tall and rose 760 feet to the base of a towering flagpole. It was a monument to the American go-getter. The Woolworth building was the biggest advertisement in the world. It advertised the success of Frank W. Woolworth, who had begun 30 years before as a poor farm boy in upstate New York. His empire of 5 and 10 cent stores with their brilliant red and gold storefronts now covered the nation. The biggest buildings in the world had been built from selling millions of little things. In that very year, the 611 Woolworth stores sold 27,576,000 pairs of hosiery. Those are like women's pantyhose, which we don't even wear that much anymore. 12,000 gross, which is 12 dozen. So 12,000 times 12 dozen. It's a lot of mousetraps. 300,000 gross. So that's 300,000 dozens of clothespins. Tin toys, gross baby pacifiers. I mean, this is a ton of stuff that the Woolworth stores were selling. Woolworth building was a city in itself. It had 30 high-speed elevators. It held 15,000 office workers and service employees. Its own power plant generated enough electricity to light 50,000 homes. Frank Woolworth wanted an office grand enough to go with the building. On a European tour in 1913, he selected the design of the Empire Room of Napoleon's palace in Paris for the handsomest office in the country and possibly the world. For the Napoleon of American merchants, why not an office that was truly imperial? And beside his desk, he placed a bust of Napoleon. That's like a head, like a mannequin. Skyscrapers still went up and up. Above the Woolworth building rose the Chrysler building in 1930. Then in 1931 came the Empire State Building, with its 105 stories reaching up 1,250 feet, almost twice as high as the Woolworth building. It long remained the highest structure in the world. Okay, and so why did people think early elevators were dangerous? And how did Otis solve this problem? Well, they were afraid that if the rope holding the elevator cage should break, passengers would fall to their death, so he invented an automatic safety brake. What two problems needed solving before buildings could reach more than 5 or 6 stories? How to get people up and down, how to hold up the tall buildings. How did Bogardus contribute to the rise of skyscrapers? He developed new methods of construction, such as using skeleton frames for buildings. Why didn't Jenny build the entire home insurance building with wrought iron? Because steel came along, which was a better building material. And what made it easier to produce steel? Bessemer's invention of a new mass production steel furnace. Did you know that contemporary architects are now planning the opposite of a skyscraper? They're calling it an earth scraper, which would go down into the earth almost 1,000 feet. It's envisioned as a 65-story building shaped sort of like an upside-down pyramid. Where might this earth scraper appear? Beneath Mexico City. It's estimated the earth scraper would cost $800 million, but it's not yet an officially approved project. For some interesting concept drawings, you can search the internet for earth scraper. I'll see if I can find some for you. And then on your timeline, this is specifically for Zoe. Otis's Elevator Company manufactures elevators, 1854. James Bogardus builds an 8-story iron frame building, the first skyscraper, 1855. The Home Insurance Company office building in Chicago is the first true skyscraper built, 1884. The F.W. Woolworth building in New York City with 58 extra stories is the tallest building in the world, and it stayed that way until 1930, and that was 1913. And the Empire State Building was completed in 1931.